Slater Crusaders. America's the greatest country in the world. Thanks for being here. Let's start off with some good news. This first segment is going to be all good news. Last week was potentially a short week for you because we had Memorial Day on Monday, so it was a 4-day week. This is a 5-day week. It feels like a 20-day week probably. So let's start off with some good news and encouragement to begin. First, Joe Manchin, Senator from West Virginia. He said that he is against ending the filibuster, and he's voting against H.R. 1 in the Senate. We've talked a lot about H.R. 1 here. It would federalize all of the worst election laws in the country. Same-day voter registration, no ID necessary to vote, universal mail-in voting. All the worst Democrat ideas for voting are all bundled into H.R. 1 and made national, regardless of your local or state laws. The worst thing it does is it would have, it's not going to pass anymore, it would have changed the Federal Election Commission from a 6-person committee that has 3 Democrats and 3 Republicans and make it a 5-person board, all of them nominated by Joe Biden. Right? It's 800 pages long. It's a disaster. And Joe Manchin, who is a Democrat, but he's in West Virginia, so he's like old school Democrat, so he's still pretty conservative. This is what he said. He said, I believe that partisan voting legislation will destroy the already weakening binds of our democracy. And for that reason, I will vote against the For the People Act, H.R. 1. Furthermore, I will not vote to weaken or eliminate the filibuster. So the filibuster, in short, the filibuster says that 60 votes are needed to move forward to an actual vote. If you get rid of the filibuster, then you would only need 50 votes in order to pass something, which would make the Senate super partisan. The reason no one's ever done this before, no Senate's ever gotten rid of the filibuster and made it a 50-vote majority in order to pass something, is because that party knows that one day the other party will be in the majority and then they'll have their unrestrained way on whatever they want to pass. So no one's ever wanted to get rid of that 60-vote threshold. The thing is, and the reason the Democrats are pushing this now is because they want to couple getting rid of the filibuster with H.R. 1. So they want to end the filibuster, then immediately pass H.R. 1 to make sure that they never lose an election ever again and always keep their majority. Does that make sense? Anyone in the past who ever ended the filibuster, there was a risk that the other party would eventually take over and then, right? But if you pass H.R. 1 and you'll never lose the majority ever again, well, yeah, then that was the play. Get rid of the filibuster, keep your majority forever. Alas, not going to happen, thanks to Joe Manchin in West Virginia. So that's a big First Amendment win, I would say, particularly that part about the Election Commission. Let's move on to a big Second Amendment win. We're going to talk a lot more about this one tomorrow, but a California judge said that California's assault rifle ban, it goes back to 1989, that ban is unconstitutional. The banned assault weapons are not bazookas, howitzers, or machine guns. Those arms are dangerous and solely useful for military purposes. Instead, the firearms deemed assault weapons are fairly ordinary, popular, modern rifles. This is an average case about average guns used in average ways for average purposes. So he struck down the ban, said it has to end in the next 30 days. We're going to do more about this tomorrow because at 1 o'clock Pacific today on my radio show, we're going to talk to the lawyer who won that case. But just know, and let's celebrate, great win for our Second Amendment and of all places, California. What do you say? Should we keep the good news coming? Good First Amendment news, good Second Amendment news. Let's keep it rolling. Ron DeSantis, surely running for president. He's my pick so far, there's no question. He's stated where he is standing. How do I word this? How he's going to fight moving forward. And this is a super important question. For a long time, Republicans in D.C. have focused, or at least said that they care about fiscal issues. Right? I'm a Republican, so I'm for lower taxes and less regulation and lower spending. Right? They haven't achieved that goal ever, but that was the Republican Party. And Republicans have been very, or at least the part of the Republican Party that's been leading the Republican Party, has been very wary to jump into any cultural issues, right? They don't want to rock the boat, and they haven't gotten involved. And because of that, I mean, as we talked about last week, they have drag queens singing about gay pride parade and transgendered beavers who have had top surgery on Blue's Clues in Nick Jr. This is what happens when you don't fight the culture war. The left just runs roughshod all over and takes it from you. So Ron DeSantis, not only a fiscal conservative, of course, but he has declared himself here as a culture warrior as well. Good, we need more of this.
Some of these battles with what the left is doing and wokeism, it's effectively cultural Marxism. And so you can have theoretically a successful economy, but if the underpinnings of the culture are just being torn apart, I don't think that that's a society that's going to be very, very successful over the long term.
Mm-hmm. So good. At the very least, you can't have a successful economy if you're not winning the culture war. Because the culture war, the front lines of the culture war, are fought in our schools. And the more time the left is teaching our kids about transgenderism and sexual identities and undermining parental authority, the more time they're spending doing that, the less time they're teaching reading and writing. Therefore, worse economy. The more time that our schools are focused on critical race theory and teaching kids that showing up on time is white supremacy, right? And dressing appropriately and respecting elders is white supremacy. The less time you have to teach kids to read and write. The cultural war, here, I'll give you the effects of the culture war here. The Worldview Survey, it's published every year. I forget what school does it, somewhere in Arizona. Half of millennials, only half of millennials believe that the golden rule should apply. It's called the golden rule. You have half of millennials who are like, it doesn't really matter. And around 35% of millennials, and other generations it's like 10%. So 35% of millennials think you should seek revenge on those who have wronged you. Okay, these are cultural battles that clearly the right, Christians, have lost in the millennial generation, no doubt. The golden rule? And 35% are like, I should definitely seek revenge on that. Whoa, those are culture war battles. No economy can survive that, right? No economy can survive in a culture where you seek revenge on everyone all the time and you don't treat people how you want to be treated yourself. No economic activity can even take place properly in that economy. So if you don't win the culture war, there is no economy. And if you don't win the culture war, there's no country either. I love stories of parents fighting back. So let's end on this, because we all need to stand up. Everyone, you must push back in this culture war. Don't just wait for Ron DeSantis to do it. Don't wait for the courts to do it. You need to do it. And the front line is your kid's school. Two moms I want to highlight here. This is a mom in Rhode Island. She wanted to get some information on the critical race theory that was being taught in her kid's kindergarten classroom. Right? Her kid's coming home and she found out from her kid that they don't use boys and girls. Like the term, hey, boys and girls, they don't use that in the classroom anymore, right? It's too gender specific. Her kid was talking about, they talked about what the white man should have done differently around Thanksgiving time, right? This is kindergarten. So she asked for the curriculum. What are you teaching my kid exactly? And they wouldn't tell her. So she filed a Freedom of Information Act request to get the curriculum. And they kept giving her a little bit here and there, and not the full thing, and a little bit, blah, 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 blah. So she kept asking and asking and asking. She ended up asking 160 times. And the school district last week voted on whether or not to sue her. To sue her. Not to whether or not to give her the information, but whether or not to sue the mom for asking to see the records. Asking to see the curriculum of her daughter's school. It's a public school. Just release the curriculum already. That's in Rhode Island. This is a mom in Colorado standing up to the school board. Now, as you're listening to this, just know that you can do this too. It doesn't have to look just like this, but you can do this too. In fact, you must.
In that training, it talks about oppressors and oppressed. That is damaging to every group of children. First of all, some groups of children are thought of as being shamed for who they are. The others are taught that they are victims without the ability to further themselves and to look at the others as the enemies. We all know the Dr. King quote that has been shared, color of our skin versus the content of our character. He had a dream. This is a nightmare. It is a nightmare for our children, and it needs to end now. The training also, by the way, divides basically educators and parents, because in the training, it refers to parents as dissenters. We are not dissenters. We are the parents. It goes on to say, and train educators to tell dissenters that this is simply the way we are going to educate your children. They're our children. We are the ones that have the moral authority over their education. We will not be marginalized.
Great. On my website, mikeslater.locals.com, one of our local schools in San Diego here, they're asking for public record or public comment on their new ethnic studies curriculum. So we're encouraging at least our local listeners, and please, you're invited as well, mikeslater.locals.com to fight back in one small way here. But your school district has a fight as well. That mom goes on and says, the job of the school is to educate kids. And in her school district, only 59% of the students are proficient in reading, and 48 are proficient in math, 48%. That's way higher than most districts even, but it's still not nearly good enough. And we're going to spend more time on critical race theory? Now, what do we need more of instead? I'm going to play this video 1,000,000 times. I think this is time number 3 or 4, but get ready. I'm going to play it 1,000,000 times. This is what we need more of.
Daddy teaches you can be anything in this world that you want to be, right? Don't Daddy teach you that?
Yeah, and it doesn't matter if you're black or white or any color.
Doesn't matter if you're black, white, brown, yellow. Right?
Black.
And how we treat people is based on who they are and not what color they are.
And if they're nice and smart.
See, this is how children think right here. Critical race theory wants to end that. Not with my children. It's not gonna happen. My baby's gonna know that no matter what she wants to be in life, all she has to do is work hard, and she can become that.
Work hard, even though you don't know anyone. You can make friends.
Yeah, you can make friends, no matter what color they are. So we need to stop CRT. Period. Point blank. Children do not see skin color, man. They love everybody. If they're good people, they love them.
We pray for people that are hurt.
So what's a better lesson for our kids, for that little girl, for your kids? To be angry and bitter at white people and white oppressive systems in a country built on a legacy of slavery starting at 1619 that you're still oppressed by today? Or God loves you, love others, treat others how you want to be treated. Don't seek revenge, work hard, be friends with people, we're all the same. What's a better lesson for our kids? It's a better lesson for adults. It's not complicated. So the true story is, fight the culture war, or there will be no economy. Fight the culture war, or there will be no country. Now, in this culture war battle, I don't want to discount the reality of and the inevitability of economic failings that are to come too. We need to do both. Inflation is going to catch so many people off guard, and people are going to lose their minds. Just as certain as that is a natural disaster. Are you ready for the next natural disaster? The best way to ensure that you survive and thrive is to prepare now with an emergency stockpile of food. My Patriot Supply, they're the best. Here's my bottom line. You can't help others if you're stranded and without food yourself. So get what you need now before the next crash or disaster or pandemic happens. My Patriot Supply, they're the best. Millions of families over a decade, 39,000 4 and 5 stars reviews, stays fresh for 25 years, 2,000 calories, 2,000 calorie meals. No one else comes close to that. Save 25% on their 4-week emergency food kit. Just get that 25% off. Crazy savings, 25%. Preparewiththefirst.com, 25% off their 4-week emergency food kit. Preparewiththefirst.com. Spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders, never believe these people again. How many times do you have to be lied to, tricked, and manipulated before you stop believing these people, or at least continue to ask questions? There's a study of tech companies, and they found that the companies that have made this big public declaration, this big Black Lives Matter pledge, those companies have 20% fewer black employees than the companies that didn't. Not surprising, right? Let's jump to COVID. I mean, that's the biggest one, obviously, right? How did the experts come up with their death projections? They made them up. The Imperial College was one of the big ones that did this. Imperial College was run by Neil Ferguson, right? Neil Ferguson is the Fauci of England, right? Think the Tony Fauci of England, who had to resign in disgrace pretty early on with the whole thing because he broke quarantine to go have sex with a married woman, right? There he is. People said, well, where did you come up with these projections? And I'm not even kidding. He said, it's so complicated, you can't understand it. Then he later admitted that they don't even know what their model is because they've been adding to it for so long, they're not even really sure what it is. They're just plugging in a bunch of numbers and then it just spits out, and they don't even know what the machine model is in the middle that results in the projections, right? But let's focus on Neil Ferguson for a second. He's been wrong many times before. 2001, Neil Ferguson, Imperial College. Does that name ring a bell? Imperial College, right? You've seen all the graphs and everything. That's all from Imperial College. In 2001, Neil Ferguson said 150,000 people are going to die from foot and mouth disease. 200 died. 2005, he said 150 million people would die from the bird flu. 282 people died. 2009, he said the swine flu would kill 65,000 people. It killed 457. Why would we ever listen to that guy ever again? How can someone be so wrong so many times for so long and still have any credibility at all? I guess when you don't pay any consequences for being wrong, you have no skin in the game, right? Elon Musk called him an utter tool who does absurdly fake science. There's a doctor in San Diego. He's the head of a cancer research center. He said, I'm normally reluctant to say this about a scientist, but he dances on the edge of being a publicity-seeking charlatan. And still, he's one of the main guys who led us into absolute panic. But it's not just COVID. It's the same old story. I've been exploring this point a lot recently. I think I've mentioned it a few times here too. We are addicted. Humans are addicted to fear, anxiety, and hatred. We're addicted to it. Fear, anxiety, and hatred. We need more and more and more and more of this to feel satisfied. And just like any addiction, you need to elevate it, right? You need, not only do you need it constantly, but you need more of it, right? And whenever I was thinking of this, I was like, well, I don't know. Can you really be addicted to a bad thing? And I was like, yeah, of course, you idiot. Like no one's addicted to broccoli, right? People are addicted to ice cream. People are addicted to brownies, right? People are addicted to food that's not good for you. Same thing with fear, anxiety, and hatred. We're just addicted to it. So now that COVID's gone and we don't have that fear and we don't have that thing to put our fear, anxiety, and hatred onto, what are we going to put it on? Got to put it on something. And there's a bunch of things, right? Obviously race, right? We're going to put it back on that whole thing still. But I think climate change, it's the same playbook. Global warming, it's the same playbook. Global warming is the fakest science of them all. Talk about modeling. COVID and global warming, it's the same script. It's the exact same script. We were on global warming for a long time, and then we took that script, applied it to COVID, and now that COVID's over, we're going to take that same script and put it back on climate change. This is a CBS News report from the other day. It's the CBS News climate specialist. He was asked, how dire is this expected to get? And he goes on this whole thing about 1.5 degrees Celsius. He went on for a minute about 1.5 degrees Celsius, a terrible thing. Things are going to get worse and worse and worse. But check out this follow-up question about where that 1.5 degrees came from.
the intensity of these extreme weather events will pick up. We'll see compounded events, heat waves on top of sea level rise, on top of large hurricanes and impactful hurricanes. And so things will just get worse and worse if we breach that. And the bottom line is by 2030, 2035, unless we really rein in our emissions very quickly, we are likely to get to 1.5 degrees and continue to increase our warming close to 2 degrees. And again, we have to do something very quickly about it, or we're inevitably heading in that direction.
You say that, Jeff, that this is a symbolic marker. Why?
Yeah, because, I mean, humans chose it, right? We chose 1.5. We chose 2 degrees. So, again, it's not a tipping point. It's not like we're going to fall off a cliff. It's just that things will get progressively worse and worse at a faster clip as we head towards that. We'll see bigger hurricanes. We'll see worse floods. We'll see worse wildfires. And we're probably setting ourselves up for a pretty bad wildfire season in the West this year.
All right, Jeff Bardelli, thanks so much.
So they just made it up. 1.5 degrees Celsius. How did you choose that number? We just chose it. Or what's so special about that number? Humans chose it. Are you kidding me? And we've been saying this for years. Like if COVID didn't blow the top off of this, nothing will. Right? You'll never be convinced that these people are motivated by just human nature. It's fear, panic, power, money, using whatever thing people are panicking over for a political end. And the same tactics are used to silence you, right? You're the denier. Same thing, right? Climate change and COVID are the exact same thing when it comes to looking at human nature and the people who are pushing it and how they treat those who have genuine questions. Questions like, so where did that 1.5 degree thing come from? Oh, we just made it up. And I'm not going to go to the whole climate change thing because, right? But like 1.5 degrees, what does that even mean? 1.5 degrees. 1.5 degrees where? 1.5 degrees where? Over the whole planet? The whole planet? I live in San Diego. It's going to be 80 degrees today here. In Siberia, it's going to be -10. So what's the temperature? What's the average temperature, and over what time period? Over an entire year? Average temperature of the whole planet over a whole year compared to what other time period? Right? I'm asking these basic questions, and what do you get called? A denier. You ask basic questions about COVID, and what are you called? You want to kill grandma? Same thing. Give you a quick side story, one more example. FDR wanted to increase the price of gold to help out farmers. Big, long story. And the Treasury Secretary, he went to FDR, and he said, why do you want to raise the price of gold 21 cents? Like, what's up with 21 cents? What's the big deal? And FDR said, well, 7 times 3 is 21. And the Treasury Secretary goes, what's 7? Who cares about 7 and 3? Oh, well, those are lucky numbers. The Treasury Secretary literally went back and wrote in his journal, if anyone knew how we really set the price of gold through a combination of lucky numbers, I think they would be frightened. Yeah, we would be, and we're no better today. I'll end on this. Never forget the public health experts who demanded that you must stay home. You must never leave your house. You got to cancel weddings. Don't go to church, miss funerals, potentially lose your job. Kids miss over a year of school. People miss routine doctor appointments, which will lead to missing cancer diagnoses, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Right? You can't do anything. You can't leave anywhere. You can't visit your family. No matter what you do, you're going to kill grandma, the whole thing. And then, as soon as the Black Lives Matter protests started, those same people came out publicly and said addressing systemic racism is more important than stopping the spread of COVID. Racism is a public health emergency that's more important. Get out there and protest even though no one else is allowed to go anywhere. Never forget that. You have every right to be skeptical of the experts. It's even understandable to be very cynical. But let's channel that to boldly asking questions and not stopping until we get to the true story. No matter how much of a bigot or a denier you are called in that process. True story. Mike Slater. By the way. Slater Crusaders, President Trump speaking in North Carolina over the weekend. Check out this line.
The survival of America depends upon our ability to elect Republicans at every level, starting with the midterms next year. We have to get it done. The cancel culture, the defunding culture, the defending culture, and they defend the wrong things. We're not going to let it go any longer. We're going to stand up for our values. We have to stand up for our values, and we're going to take back our country.
One of the reasons we got to win elections is so that people in power can appoint wonderful judges. And we kicked off the show with a very short, we'll do more tomorrow, on the federal judge in Southern California who struck down the 1989, or ruled unconstitutional, the 1989 assault weapons ban. Elections have consequences, and in the courts is one of the most important of these consequences. Josh Hammer is the Newsweek opinion editor and a research fellow with the Edmund Burke Foundation, and he wrote a wonderful piece in the Harvard Journal of Law, Common Good Originalism, Our Tradition and Our Path Forward. Josh, how are you, brother?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me back on, Mike.
Yeah, good to talk to you. So you start off your article here about conservatives, Republicans, who have won the presidency and then gone on to appoint some justices who, in the Supreme Court, who what? Betrayed? Is that too strong of a word? Or how would you describe it?
No, I don't think betray is too strong of a word. This has been a pet peeve of mine since literally my first year of law school 8 years ago. I've been hammering this point home over and over and over again over the years. I mean, we can literally, as I do in the article, we can literally go as far back as President Dwight D. Eisenhower. I mean, he nominated to the court William Brennan, who was a liberal line on the court for decades. Harry Blackmun, the author of Roe versus Wade, was a Richard Nixon nominee. Ditto John Paul Stevens, one of the court's great liberals. Even President Reagan, for all that he did correct. I mean, he nominated, Anthony Kennedy and Sandra Day O'Connor, who were both very squishy, kind of centrist judges. George H.W. Bush, of course, famously nominated to the court David Souter, who immediately within 2 or 3 years at the most was a solid left-leaning member of the court. George W. Bush nominates Chief Justice Roberts. We all know how that story ends. And then kind of to fast forward a little bit here, the impetus for kind of my launching off point for this new kind of jurisprudential theory that I'm calling common good originalism was Justice Neil Gorsuch's defection in the Bostock case of last June. It was kind of an eye-opening, I think, wake-up call for me and a lot of other legal judicial conservatives. And in that case, it was a Title VII case, a statutory case from the Civil Rights Act of 1964. We're dealing with employment discrimination in the context of hiring and firing decisions. Justice Gorsuch writes for a 6-3 court joined by Chief Justice Roberts, because of course. And he basically interprets discrimination on the basis of, quote, sex as being discrimination on the basis of sex, sexual orientation, or gender identity. Notwithstanding the fact that not a single legislator in 1964 had that in mind, notwithstanding the fact that Congress repeatedly voted down the option of legislatively codifying in the statutory law that exact premise. So that's kind of the backdrop here. A lot of frustration. I'm trying to propose something a little new, but at the same time, it's something new. It's actually just a rediscovery of our authentic tradition, I think.
Which is what we always need to be doing. So real quick, before we move on to that thing, who do you blame here? That's not quite right. But were the presidents, they just made bad decisions, or were these justices did they deceive throughout their entire careers, or did something happen once they got on the court that made them change their philosophies? What happened with these people?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's really kind of an all of the above situation, right? So Linda Greenhouse, who was famously kind of a New York Times Supreme Court beat writer for decades, we call this the so-called greenhouse effect, not in the ozone layer, but in judicial nominations. And the greenhouse effect basically stipulates, or at least it theorizes, it speculates that Republican judicial nominees, once they get to D.C., they all move to the left for various kind of social reasons. It's kind of the proverbial Georgetown cocktail party reason, right? No one wants Linda Greenhouse or the other kind of writers to write scathing hit pieces against you. We frankly still see that to this day. Even Justice Brett Kavanaugh, there was a very recent essay from McKay Coppins at the Atlantic magazine. It was a kind of a long essay. And it's very difficult. It was a portrayal of Justice Kavanaugh. It's very difficult to kind of read that essay and come away with the conclusion that Brett Kavanaugh is not still trying to virtue signal. He doesn't still want to be liked given what happened to them. So that is obviously part of it here. But kind of the other deeper root, and that's kind of what I'm really getting at here, is that I think what conservatives have viewed oftentimes as kind of conservative jurisprudence over the past 30, 40, 50 years, frankly, oftentimes amounts to kind of tying one hand behind our back. Liberal jurisprudence going back at least to the New Deal era, at least to the 1930s. There's a famous 1938 case called Caroline Products. There's a very famous footnote in there, footnote 4. Ever since Caroline Products, footnote 4, the liberal left has not batted an eyelash. They go at it every single time on authentically substantive grounds. They rule judicially according to what they believe as a normative matter is correct, whether it's dignity, egalitarianism, whether the issue is privacy, abortion, same-sex relations, all that stuff. The legal right tries to take a purported moral high ground of neutrality. We basically say, look, all we're doing here is kind of a basic historical inquiry. All we're looking at is the original meaning of the words. But when you are so obsessed with removing judges from basic philosophical moorings and considering kind of the truths that underlie the founding generation, the framers of the Constitutional Convention themselves, what you come away with are defections like Gorsuch and Bostock. You tie one hand behind your back. You say you can't even look at what is actually going on here from a broader perspective, and that's going to lead to messy results.
What's this footnote 4 say exactly?
So Caroline Products footnote 4, I mean, it was basically a case at kind of the height of the New Deal. And what the court, I actually don't remember the justice who wrote it. It was one of kind of the liberal members of the New Deal era court. The famous line is about, quote, discrete and insular minorities. And it effectively kind of over the subsequent decades, liberal jurisprudence would come to kind of exalt the notion that the law has to go above and beyond to protect, quote, discrete and insular minorities. In my lay writings on this, I've kind of referred to it as kind of the, quote, implicit intersectionality of Caroline Products footnote 4. It's kind of like what I cite as like the modern birth of like an identity politics centric, like uber egalitarian jurisprudence.
Okay, I hate to do this to you. We got about 2 minutes left, but what do you suggest instead? And in your article, help me if I get this wrong. I'm sure I do. In popular culture, we have like the progressive living constitution view, and then you have no. The conservatives should be originalists, not these progressive living constitution. We need to be originalists. But inside of this originalist bubble or tent, you break it down into 3 different types of originalist philosophies. Is that accurate?
Yeah. So long story short, originalism as a kind of a time and place theoretical development was a direct response to kind of the excesses of the Warren Court from the 1960s and to a slightly lesser extent, the Burger Court that followed it. The first wave of originalists, Judge Bob Bork, Justice Antonin Scalia, were very heavy on judicial restraint. It was what we would call legal positivism. It was kind of a historical inquiry that there was one right answer, and that the judge's hands were totally tied from so much as considering anything above and beyond that. Over subsequent decades, you had kind of a more authentically kind of libertarian strand of originalism that would kind of imbue this historical inquiry with more kind of like Enlightenment liberal, kind of like John Locke, Declaration of Independence inspired classical liberal norms. And then you actually have kind of a, like you said, a more kind of progressive kind of living constitutionalist strand. My issue is that I'm not a libertarian, I'm not a progressive, I'm a conservative. So I look at this and I say, where is like the substantively conservative strand of originalist jurisprudence? That's what I'm trying to do here. The point, though, is that my claim is that this actually is our inheritance. It's basically rooted in the preamble of the Constitution. It is rooted in kind of the thought of Alexander Hamilton, of the great Chief Justice John Marshall. If you kind of go back and trace it, we've really kind of moved away in recent decades from what our actual inheritance is from the great English common lawyers, from people like Edmund Burke himself. And I'm kind of just trying to get conservatives to become more comfortable with thinking along these lines. So that's the upshot here. I'm trying to kind of develop an authentically conservative strand of originalist jurisprudence, but my claim simultaneously is that this is not novel. It's actually our genuine and true inheritance.
Love it. Last question. Can you give us an example of what that might look like in a case, in a recent case, in a case that's soon to come, or something that we can deeply understand this?
Yeah, absolutely. So the issue of kind of the 14th Amendment and abortion has been in the news a lot recently. There was a long essay at First Things Magazine, the wonderful conservative journal. I think it was in the March or April issue, I can't remember, from John Finnis, who is one of the great kind of natural law scholars over the past 40, 50 years. And he kind of advanced the claim that some others, including my good friend Josh Craddock, have made, which basically says that the 14th Amendment does not just, the traditional conservative stance that Roe versus Wade is wrong because the Constitution is silent, that it's just a state issue for abortion, right? But what Professor Finnis and others actually say is that if you look carefully, the Equal Protection Clause protecting persons under the law was understood to include all natural persons, which we obviously know, due to the basic science, includes unborn persons. So my claim here is that, when you're looking at a clause, and here we're talking specifically about the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, when there are numerous kind of historically plausible competing interpretations that are not demonstrably erroneous, that might both be plausible to the kind of the modern scholar looking at the historical inquiry, at that point we should err on the side of kind of the overall substantive orientation, what Aristotle would call the telos, the purpose of the American regime, which I root in the preamble of the Constitution, which talks about kind of natural justice, the general welfare, the common good, a more perfect union, kind of nationalist, more common good oriented goals. So in the specific abortion context there, where you kind of have like more multiple kind of plausible, non-erroneous possibilities for the proper interpretation, I would err on the side in this particular instance of John Finnis' scholarship because, again, for substantive reasons, we know that abortion is a taking of a human life. It is manifestly contrary to natural justice and the common good and human flourishing. Therefore, kind of for substantive reasons, when in the kind of that realm of reasonable doubt, we should err on the side of the preamble of the Constitution.
Love it. Hopefully that whets everyone's palate enough to go check out and read the whole thing. It's in the Harvard Law Journal, or Journal of Law, Common Good Originalism. Josh, good to talk to you, brother. Thanks for doing this.
You bet. Anytime.
Thanks for writing. Thanks for being here. Coming up next, we got Professor Vince Racaniello, virologist of Columbia University. We'll talk with him next about the lab leak. True story. Mike Slater, spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders. We got to go right to Professor Vincent Racaniello. He is a virologist at Columbia University, and he's been with us the entire step of the way. Microbe.tv for his podcast This Week in Virology. Professor, how are you, sir?
Hey, good to be back. Nice to see you.
In your Columbia headquarters. Good to talk to you, sir. All right, Professor, I got to ask you. Lab leak. Here's it. Now, Professor, hear me out, Professor. Last time we talked about it, you said no chance. I think, something like that. And now we see more virologists coming out being like, hey, we need to at least look more into this. We don't know either way. Where do you stand today on the potential that this leaked from a lab at the Wuhan Institute of Virology?
I still don't think it came from the lab. It came from nature. I'm sticking with my no chance. I think these other virologists who are jumping on the bandwagon, that's what they're doing. I don't think they're thinking about it clearly. We have a lot of scientific evidence that this virus, like SARS-1 before it, came from nature. And, the live meat markets where animals are slaughtered, and if they have viruses, they can infect people. We know that's a scenario. The virus looks very much like viruses that are circulating in bats. On the other hand, there is zero science that this virus came from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. All of the stories you're hearing are pretty much bogus, in my opinion. We need to get out there into the countryside and find bats that have the ancestor of SARS-CoV-2. That's where it is, not in a lab. And I think it's a big distraction that's not helping anything.
Is there, let me find a little nuance here, suggestion, that it occurred naturally from bats in that cave in southeastern China, right? And from 2012, where some people who were shoveling out the bat guano got super sick. And it was transported to the lab to be studied and then somehow leaked out of the laboratory. So it wasn't created in a lab, but it was transported from this cave to a lab, and that's how it spread in Wuhan as opposed to the cave. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I understand what you're saying, but the viruses that they got in 2013 from that cave, from the bats in that cave, they're quite different from SARS-CoV-2, and they could not be the source of SARS-CoV-2, as you suggest. And in fact, those miners did not have COVID. That's very clear. There is no evidence that anyone in the world had any virus like SARS-CoV-2 in their lab before December 2019, including the lab in Wuhan. And in fact, the virus you're talking about, the 2013 bat virus, they didn't have it until January, and they still are not able to propagate that virus in the lab. So I think it's highly unlikely that this came through a lab. I think this needed to percolate in nature as viruses do, going from animals to humans.
I want to talk about this for hours, Professor, and we don't have enough time. Let me ask you one scientific question about and I'm mispronouncing this, obviously, the furin cleavage site. So this seems to be the argument against it being produced in a lab. Can you give me the 101 on this?
So a furin is a enzyme that cuts proteins. We're our stomach's full of them, right? You eat your food, got enzymes that chop it up. And furins are enzymes that cut proteins, and they recognize a 4 amino acid stretch in a protein and they cut it, right? So SARS-CoV-2 has a furin cleavage site in the spike protein. And that cutting of that cleavage site by furins is really important for the infectivity of the virus. Now, some people have said the furin cleavage site is a smoking gun for lab origin, but that simply is wrong, because other coronaviruses have furin cleavage sites, like MERS coronavirus and one of the common cold coronaviruses that infect us. And if you go out and look in bats, you can see the beginnings of furin cleavage sites. So, originally people said, someone must have put this in to some virus and it became SARS-CoV-2, but it's just not right. There's no virus to put it in. So that's the story there.
What's your stance on gain of function experiments? Why are these a good thing to do?
First of all, gain of function refers to almost anything you do with a virus, a bacteria, or fungus in the lab to give it a different property. So if I took a bacteria and, say, made it resistant to an antibiotic, that would be a gain of function mutation. If you wanted to stop all gain of function work, you would basically stop most of virology, microbiology, mycology, and many other fields. The problem is gain of function got to be a bad word a number of years ago because it was referring to some experiments with influenza viruses looking at transmission. So what we need to do is use gain of function to understand. In this case, the question is, what viruses in bats pose a threat to people? So you can take the spike proteins from those viruses in bats and put them into other bat viruses in the lab and ask if they can infect human cells. And if they do, that suggests that maybe we should pay attention to them. That's a gain of function experiment, which is completely necessary for us to understand the threat of bat viruses to humans.
Which is totally different than what that doctor in the Netherlands did, that researcher in the Netherlands with that bird virus, and made it more transmissible. It seems like why would you, we only got a minute. Why would you do it? Why would you make something more transmissible other than, you just said why we would see if it is transmissible. Why would researchers want to make it more transmissible?
Well, you have these avian influenza viruses that occasionally infect people, and they're pretty lethal, but they don't transmit from person to person. And the question is, why don't they? So you can do an experiment in the lab and try and make them more transmissible for an animal. And that was done, and we learned a lot about what controls transmission. What was overlooked is in the process of making them more transmissible, they lost their ability to kill the host. So it's always a trade-off, and those experiments actually were quite safe and informative.
Professor, that was not nearly enough time. My understanding is we're off next week, and then you're back again, and then you guys start teaching summer classes. So I don't know if we're going to be able to meet again, at least not regularly. So for our grand finale, let's spend some more time together, and we can have a big blowout for us.
Sounds good.
Because we're grateful for you, sir. Microbe.tv is the website. This Week in Virology, the podcast. Go check it out. Vince Racaniello. True story. Mike Slater. Be back tomorrow. Spread the word.